Hello and good evening to our alumni and other friends of the University of Toronto tuning in from all over the world. My name is Claire Kennedy, a U of T alum, Senior Advisor of Clients and Industries at Bennett Jones, and your moderator for tonight's discussion. Welcome to this latest installment of Disruptors and Dilemmas, hosted by the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering at the University of Toronto. Our theme tonight is net zero, not a zero-sum game, Canada's opportunities in a climate-positive energy transition. At the recently concluded COP26 talks in Glasgow, Canada signed on to a national goal of a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030, and we're already committed to net zero by 2050. The International Energy Agency has stated that a goal of net zero globally means meeting the needs of an economy twice the size of today's, with 2 billion more people, and yet with 8% less energy. Certainly a defining challenge for our time, and there is a lot to talk about. Before I get to our panel, though, I do want to introduce our host, Professor Chris Yip, who is Dean of the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering at U of T, to say just a few remarks. Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks, Claire. Great to see so many of you joining us this evening from around the world. Our topic tonight is certainly one that we are all very familiar with, but we're approaching it from what we hope is a different angle, a fresh angle. And as we are all starting to see, climate change is bringing plenty of challenges, including more severe weather like we've experienced here. And certainly our thoughts are with those in BC and this past weekend, and those in Newfoundland now who just got hit by a big storm. But we're also seeing the growth of new technologies, new forms of energy, and entirely new industries. And as makers, innovators, and leaders, our engineering graduates are really well positioned to be the forefront of this change. We're using our expertise to help design a world that is not only cleaner and greener, but more prosperous and equitable than the one we have today. But we know we can't do this alone. We really need new philosophies, new economic systems, and new forms of governance. It's a multidisciplinary challenge. Engineers love multidisciplinary challenges. And to address it, we have put together a multidisciplinary dream team. The University of Toronto's Climate Positive Energy Research Initiative brings together more than 90 experts from across all three of our U of T campuses. Our goal is ambitious: to support Canada and the world in achieving net negative carbon emissions by 2050. And to do this while mitigating inequities in access to clean energy and the consequences of production. The strength of our approach is the recognition that technology and policy really are inseparable. Some of our barriers to reaching net zero, of course, come from the laws of thermodynamics, but many more come from political, human, and societal factors. Our panel tonight includes 4 experts from an impressively diverse range of fields, and together they are perfectly positioned to help us understand how these factors interact. It's a great example of what U of T is terrific at, which is really catalyzing unexpected collaborations. I'm really pleased to join along with my fellow deans and principals in welcoming you here today. Before I turn things back to our tonight's moderator, Claire Kennedy, I really want to thank her once again for the key role she's played in creating what is now Disruptors and Dilemmas. When we started the speaker series, it really more than 10 years ago. We didn't know it would grow into such a massive and open and really interdisciplinary institution that it is today. And a lot comes down to Claire and her vision. And on behalf of everyone here, I want to tell her again how much we appreciate all that she's done on its behalf. And last, and certainly not, I want to thank our sponsors for making tonight possible. Our presenting sponsor, Bennett Jones, our pillar sponsors, TD Insurance and MBNA. Thank you again for making the space for this important conversation. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Claire to introduce our panel, and let's get started.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. I think you're exactly right when you described our panel as a dream team, and I'm going to go to some very brief introductions in just a moment, but just a quick housekeeping item on Q&A. A thank you to all our audience members who have submitted questions in advance. It's not too late though, don't despair. You can continue to pose questions to our panel through the Q&A function, which you can navigate to you on your screen, and we will do our very best to get to as many of the questions as possible. So let me come to that multidisciplinary panel that we've assembled for you here tonight. Jody Graywall is an assistant professor of accounting in the Department of Management and the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto's Mississauga campus, with a cross appointment to the Rotman School of Management. Jody's research examines the capital markets and real effects of financial and sustainability information disclosed voluntarily and under mandatory reporting regimes. Welcome, Jody. Joe Heath is a professor in the Department of Philosophy and at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. His most recent book, Philosophical Foundations of Climate Change Policy, published in 2021, is an inquiry into the normative principles that should inform our approach to climate change mitigation. Welcome, Joe. David Sinton is a professor in the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at U of T, and he holds the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Microfluidics and Energy. David is a double grad of U of T Engineering, having completed his BASC and his PhD at the University of Toronto. Welcome, David. Laura Tozer is an assistant professor of environmental studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Her research focuses on the governance of energy and urban sustainability transitions, on resilient and equitable cities, and on the dynamics and politics of environmental governance. Laura is also a double grad of U of T, having completed her MA and her PhD in the Department of Geography and Planning. Welcome, Laura. So let's jump right in. The theme of tonight's panel is a net zero, not a zero-sum game. And we're certainly going to talk about opportunities. Chris highlighted that fact in his opening. And there are many for Canada and for all of us at U of T. But I don't want to gloss over the fact that the path to net zero is not necessarily going to be easy. It's not going to be free of hard transitions. And I would say that's especially true for an energy-dependent economy like Canada. So starting with that tough stuff, I'm going to ask each of you, what do you think one of the hardest adjustments for Canada is going to be, and how should we tackle it? Let me start with David, and then I'm going to go to Jody, Joe, and Laura.
Thanks, Claire. There's an advantage to being first in this question. I'll say one of the challenges is we're a small country. So we really have two jobs before us. One is we can do a lot better on our emissions, and you alluded to that in your question. So emissions per capita, and be an example for the world. But that's not enough, because that won't be a globally scaled solution. So we need to export. We need to export great clean tech, and we need to export great policy.
Great. Let me come then to Jody.
Thanks a lot, Claire. I'm so happy to be here. I really think that Canada needs to shift from being a country that tends to watch and follow to one that leads and takes bold action. I think there's three areas where we need to take this action right away. The first, as David alluded to, is the zero carbon technology development. And I think our government has a really big role to play here. Right now, most companies underinvest in R&D on clean tech, and that's just because it's really expensive and uncertain relative to fossil fuel alternatives. And, as an economist and someone who's working with these companies, we really can't fault them for not wanting to lose money. Instead, we need to focus on providing the right incentives to innovate. So we need public investment because we need those breakthrough ideas. And when an idea is in its early stages, when we're not sure if it's going to work out and how long it's going to take to become profitable, that's when governments are needed to provide that development of those early stage ideas, because banks and venture capitalists are not yet willing to do it. And I think, Canada's carbon goals are there, and the Dean referred to them at the start, but I'm pretty concerned a little bit about how, we're going to approach that and our plan to actually get there. So, one example is our proposed conversion of coal-fired plants to natural gas ones. On the one hand, this will allow us to show, big reductions over the next few years, but it's not necessarily going to get us on that pathway to decarbonize by 2050, which is what every rich country like Canada needs to do. And again, it comes back to economics. If we're going to build those plants, we're going to need to keep operating them into 2050 and beyond in order to recover the costs of having built them in the first place. And those natural gas plants are not, zero carbon, right? So we have to be thinking beyond the low and the medium hanging fruit to some of those real radical transformations in our infrastructure to get us to zero by 2050. And the third, I just want to make a quick note about our policy, right? And our carbon tax, I think, is moving in the right direction, especially with this new Supreme Court ruling to uphold Ottawa's right to impose a tax on provinces where the climate policies are not up to federal standards. But there's just many loopholes there and exceptions, especially for heavy industry. We need to iron those out, get that solid carbon tax in place. And then I think we need to think about border adjustments so that the carbon price doesn't just apply to Canadian products, but also to products that we import. It's going to be tricky politically, very much acknowledge that. But again, these are the bold moves that we need to demonstrate our leadership.
Yeah, so lots to do and no shortage of challenges. Let me go to you, Joe, and then I'm going to come to Laura.
Yeah, thanks. So the problem I wanted to talk about is not the biggest problem, but I think is one of the hardest problems, and that's the problem of remote communities. So when we talk about renewables, there's a huge emphasis on the electrical grid, but Canada is in this funny position amongst countries of having actually a surprisingly large number of communities that are not on the grid. So Canada has just under 300 off-grid communities, 170 of which are Indigenous. And there's about a dozen have hydropower, but almost all the rest run entirely on diesel fuel, in many cases flown in by airplane. So that's where they get their electricity from and so on. And we hear a lot of talk about the North in terms of the impacts of climate change, but we seldom hear any discussion of the fact that the Northern economy is 100% fossil fuel dependent, but it's also extremely difficult to see how we change that, because most of these communities cannot feasibly be attached to the grid. They don't even have roads. And obviously solar is not attractive. Battery technology has huge limitations. Maybe somebody's working on a battery powered snowmobile, but I haven't seen any news about it. So there's actually really formidable challenges there. And again, because they're Indigenous communities, you can't just say, oh, don't live there. That's not the option. So that's actually an incredibly tough nut to crack that I have not seen significant discussion of.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. That's really highlighting that this is a challenge for us, not just coast to coast, but coast to coast to coast. And there are some particular considerations that we have in the North, and the technologies that we may be relying on in the South are not going to get us there. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of the technological opportunities a little bit later. But before we do that, let me come to Laura and ask her to highlight one of the challenges that is ahead, some of the tough stuff. Over to you, Laura.
Sure, thank you, Claire. And I really wanted to kind of frame this by saying that addressing the climate crisis means virtually eliminating the use of fossil fuels within decades in Canada. So the issue is not really our energy dependence, the way you're framing it in your intro there, Claire, but really it's about our fossil dependence, our fossil energy dependence. And this is something that we really need to face, is something to move on from and figure out how we're going to do a fossil-free transition. So if we're talking about the International Energy Agency, you mentioned in the preamble, some of the new announcements that have been coming out of that agency earlier this year. One of them was that there can be no new oil and gas extraction built anywhere in the world if we're going to have a chance of avoiding a dangerous climate change. So we're looking at the market vanishing for Canada's oil and the need for a rapid energy and economic transition for Canada. And tackling that means winding down fossil fuel production and investing in planned transitions for workers and economies with in those sectors. And moving towards an energy dependence for Canada that is in energy industries that aren't climate destroying. So trying to think about designing what a climate positive economy means for Canada. And so I think one of the hardest adjustments that we're facing here in Canada is really facing the reality of what we need to do, facing the fossil-free transition aspect of this net zero transition for Canada. We've focused a long time on where the kind of next incremental unit of greenhouse gas emission reduction is going to come from, as Jody brought up in her point as well. And we need to be thinking more about what decarbonization of our economy in the transition to a climate positive economy looks like for Canada.
Yeah, there is no shortage of challenge here for Canada, and I think that you point out the need to decarbonize. And I would say that we need to make that transition urgently, but we need to make it smoothly. And I think the challenge is particularly big for Canada, given that we have traditionally been very dependent on, for our GDP, for example, on fossil fuels and on what that means for our economy and the other things that it funds in our society, which we think are important. Let's come back to some of the technological innovation then that we are going to need to crack this nut. And I want to come to you, David, because a net zero economy is going to require massive amounts of energy. We've heard Laura say and others that is going to have to come from non-fossil fuel sources. So help us understand where we are in this technological transition. What do you see as some of the most important or promising technologies that are going to get us to net zero?
Sure. I'll give you a couple easy answers. There's not too many easy answers in this, but I'll give you my best easy answers. No brainer, no doubter solutions, and then the tougher stuff. So the two easiest answers are electric vehicles. So for small vehicle transport that can be electrified, that's as close to a no doubter solution as it gets, especially in jurisdictions like Ontario that have quite low carbon electricity. Quebec's in there as well, at BC, for instance, in Canada. So in jurisdictions like that where the grid is quite green, quite low carbon, then electric vehicles for sure. That's a great step to take. What else is an easy one? Heat pumps. Heat pumps. So heating by heat pump, again, in those same jurisdictions. And hopefully, more jurisdictions as we get more and more renewable electricity across the world. Heat pumps, it's just a better way to heat. In both those examples, the key technical point is that it's not just moving from a fossil source to an electrical source that has less associated emissions. It's not just that. It's not just the switch. It's actually using less total energy, and that's what makes them no-brainers. For instance, your stove at home, electrical, you buy an electrical stove versus a gas stove. It's not the same. They both take the same amount of total energy, and then we can talk about the emissions associated with those. But it's even easier decision. Electric vehicles, heat pumps, less total energy, better, lower carbon source. The harder stuff for me, it's in that toughest third of emissions, they call it. So heavy industry, right? Heavy transport, cement production, manufacturing, steel, right? This is the heavy stuff. This is the stuff that you want to build a hospital. You just need these materials, and there's just fundamental carbon associated with these. We need to trap it. We can't emit it. We need to do something with it, store it or convert it. And maybe just lastly, maybe we convert it and we put it into forms that communities are currently using, that Joe mentioned, and we power communities in the north using some of that carbon that we simply must emit from these manufacturing processes in the south. I can't resist. I'm just going to take 20 seconds and comment on the electrical snowmobile. Super cool technology, but why isn't it a great fit for Joe's challenge in the north? The electricity comes from diesel, right? So don't do it. Get a gas snowmobile until you can get a nice green grid up there, then run your electric snowmobile.
Good. Let me come back to you quickly because we've had a couple of questions. John and Elias have both asked about the role of nuclear, where Canada arguably has a comparative advantage. Is that going to be part of the solution here, nuclear power, David?
Yeah, great questions. And also the point there that in those questions was the hint that they come in and out of style, nuclear technology does. And in Ontario, we have a proud history of nuclear tech. It's still powering my laptop here, or 60% of it or something. So personally, I'm a big fan, and other big fans that you'll find are people that do climate models to look at how to actually how do we get to net zero? We need this power from somewhere. Nuclear, in some ways, it's the opposite of a solar source or a wind source in the sense that it's just solid base load. I mean, you cannot change these things. They just pump out the same. So it's total base load. Solar and wind do their own thing, important sources as well, but they're intermittent. They do, but base load nuclear, it's fantastic technology. SMRs are exciting because it makes the size, the capital scale of the system tractable, right? It's no longer wildly huge amounts of money, and it's just a huge amount of money.
Right. So you're talking about the small modular reactions there, or SMRs, as opposed to something like a Darlington installation. So Definitely lots to think about there. Laura, I want to come to you. We've already talked about the fact that often in the Canadian context, when we talk about the climate transition, we are talking about our fossil fuel industry. And there are changes that are needed there, and there are changes that are underway. But let's talk about urban areas. Maybe we urbanites actually need to take a look in the mirror, because cities are one of our major sources of carbon emissions. So in your view, what are the keys to unlocking the net zero potential of urban areas, and what are some of the barriers to getting there?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I have so much to say about cities. And I think the really interesting thing about cities is the potential that they offer because of the way that they concentrate resources and people and infrastructure and buildings. And these are all the parts of society that we really need to intervene in order to take climate action. So there's a kind of a concentrated potential in our cities. And there's also the potential in our cities because of the ways that they act as the sources of innovation in our society. These are places where we can try out new things and develop new behaviors and technologies and that kind of thing, and then expand them out to other places in the country. And so ambitious climate action in cities, both for resilience and to move us towards a zero carbon society. One thing I really want to people to take away here is that we can take climate action in cities while we're also increasing the quality of life and social equity in cities. So we're thinking about the kinds of solutions that have these sort of multiple climate and just what makes a good life outcomes in our society. I do want to comment on the kind of being the main source of carbon emissions to get at some of the ways that carbon emissions are baked into the systems of society. Because we can think about cities as the main source of carbon emissions, but we can also look at it by sector. And if you look by sector, then the oil and gas sector is the largest percentage of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Or you can look at it as 100 companies that have been the main source of 70% of the world's carbon emissions since 1988. So there are different ways of slicing our carbon emissions, but really what I'm getting at when I bring that up is that we have to think about transforming our systems, the systems that are running our society that we can see when we're living in cities. Not necessarily, so the importance of climate action in cities is not because so many people live there and we need to change the actions of all the people, but it's really more important to think about the ways that we can take climate action in cities to change all these sorts of transportation and energy and building systems. So when we take climate action in cities, we're rethinking these systems, but we're also rethinking other things about cities. So beyond a technical challenge, we're thinking more about what people need, where they need it, how they want to live. When we take climate action, we're thinking about, community participation and social equity in cities as well. But you also asked me about the kind of keys to unlock this potential and what we can do in cities to really accelerate action. And so I have a few ideas about that. And the first one's about who's paying the bill for decarbonization and how can we do this in a socially just way? Because the kinds of climate action we need to take in cities, we really have to unlock a lot of investment in some of these solutions. And one of these avenues is public investment for people and the planet, thinking through how we make sort of Green New Deals kinds of investments in our cities. And in this way, think about new job retraining, investment in infrastructure, all of these different things. But so that's kind of a new spending approach, but I also really want to highlight that it's essential that we integrate climate into the spending we already do in our cities. We spend a ton of money just keeping a city running, building its buildings, moving cars around, moving different kinds of transit around. And if we integrate climate into those spending decisions, we've unlocked a huge potential investment source for climate action in cities. My other I have two more kind of keys to unlock this action. And one of them is about engaging proactively with social justice. And I'm bringing this up to really talk about the political feasibility of taking climate action. And so how we can think about when we're taking climate action in cities, how can we do it in ways that protect vulnerable vulnerable people from climate change impacts, both because it's something that we need to do, but also when we expand decarbonization so that it also is done in a way that's a response to other pressing issues for people, housing affordability, gender equality, we build new constituencies of support for climate action as we combine climate change with these kind of everyday concerns of life. And the other way that we can kind of bring social justice and as a way to increase the political feasibility of climate action is to protect people from disruption. So this is involved, retraining people to be part of the climate positive economy, to be a part of green technology that's expanding, that kind of thing. This helps avoid people opposing action if they have pathways to be involved in the climate positive economy in cities. And then my final kind of key to unlock is about building momentum. Because when we talk about climate policy and trying to change our cities so that they don't produce carbon pollution, we often have in mind sort of a particular kind of change, a behavior, a technology, and all of our climate policies do that. They need an outcome that kind of changes something about how we live and how our city works. But all of these policies are also a chance to build some momentum around climate action. How can a climate policy develop new supporters? How can it build new capacities in our society? How can it change our ideas about what normal is? So these are the kind of my three keys to unlock this kind of paying for decarbonization, proactively engaging with social justice, and then this idea about climate policy building momentum so that it continues to accelerate.
Mm-hmm. So on that, Laura's raising the first point about paying for the climate transition. So I want to come to you, Jody, with a question about asset managers and more broadly green investment. Asset managers have certainly seen the opportunity in the climate transition, and literally billions of dollars are pouring into mutual funds, ETFs, and other investment products that focus on climate change and more broadly on ESG or environmental, social, and governance factors. So does sustainable investing really help the environment? Is it part of the solution, or is it really just so much greenwashing?
Thanks, Claire. So just so that we're all on the same page, the idea behind sustainable investing or ESG investing is that you can earn a solid return on your investments while at the same time helping to save the planet. So this feel-good area of finance is something that a lot of people want to try and want to get involved in, and there's no shortage of opportunities. So today you could go and put some money into a low carbon exchange traded fund or ETF. What that basically will allow you to do is earn market rate returns while tilting those underlying investments towards lower emitting companies. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, the real question here is whether and how these investment vehicles can help in our transition to a low carbon economy. In theory, right, if the growth of these products is really, really high, then somewhat indirectly, the higher emitting companies will see their costs of capital rise, so their financing costs go up because they're not part of these products. And this might, potentially incentivize them to cut their emissions because they want to get in on it. But there's a lot of holes here, and it's a lot of kind of relationships that are not really solid. And one of the arguments I would make is, well, if I'm going to see higher financing costs and higher capital costs, wouldn't that just make me less likely to invest in the carbon cutting technologies that are already really expensive? It's just going to make them even more expensive. But beyond that, I've studied these ESG statements and policies and engaged with a lot of these asset managers, institutional investors, and unfortunately, I'm really not seeing those mechanisms that link these products to our fight against climate change. I think, to put it bluntly, the ESG integration process into investment is just, it's not stable, it's inconsistent, it's unbinding, and it's unambiguous. So, even a well-meaning green fund doesn't necessarily know where to put your money because the companies themselves don't have standardized carbon reporting in most jurisdictions. It's hard for us to audit and verify their carbon pledges. But there are some good things I'm seeing from the ESG industry. Activism and engagement is definitely making a difference. So we saw this year how the hedge fund engine number one was able to appoint 3 climate conscious directors to Exxon's board. I mean, that's important. But if we think about the scale of the problem that we need to tackle and the timeline with which we need to do it, unfortunately, I don't think that this is the way. And actually, the real danger here in the ESG industry, in my view, is really delaying urgent government action and reform, because it's creating this illusion, this veil that something's being done, right? We can get this sense of comfort, but that's just not true. So let's kind of put a strong effort towards stopping this.
Right. So I think we could have a whole panel on investing and ESG, and certainly on green investing. And you're right, there is a need for standards. I mean, I think the industry and players in the industry are moving that way, but it's a landscape where there are a number of kind of competing, I'll call it regimes or standards, and we've yet to see kind of mass coalition around a very few of these. So it makes it harder and harder. And again, I think a lot of the focus has been on the fossil fuel industry, but I think it's actually going to get harder to be separating the wheat from the chaff from on an ESG perspective. Like if we just asked about sort of what is the green footprint of crypto assets, for instance, that would be an interesting question. But I do want to move on. I want to bring Joe into the conversation here. A lot of the opening kind of remarks and statements have focused on or have alluded to this need for equity in this transition. And so, I think an important part of the legitimacy of these measures that governments want to take is the belief on the part of the voting public, at least as I say in democracies. That this is a fair transition, that it's fair for workers, that it's fair for regions in our country, in Canada, as one example, or on a variety of other kind of axes. So, Joe, sort of help us unpack this question about making this transition to net zero equitable.
Sure. Focusing specifically on the transition. And I think the most interesting thing about what's been going on in Canada for the last 20 years and will be going on is that actually a lot of the conflicts that exist globally when it comes to the climate change mitigation are also reproduced domestically in microcosm in Canada, which is that we have basically 2 major poles of political power in this country. We have Alberta and we have Quebec. And the thing many people don't appreciate about Quebec is that Quebec is already pretty much finished. That is that their electrical grid is already almost 100% carbon neutral, because they get more than 95% of their electricity from hydro. And then the rest is made up typically with wind. And so Quebec has got nothing to lose and everything to gain from this kind of transition. All they have to worry about is their transport sector, which is, everyone has to worry about that. But then we have, on the other hand, Alberta. So one of the things I want to sort of urge is a little bit more sympathy for the situation of Alberta, but also a recognition of the extent to which all of Canada has benefited from what's been going on economically in Alberta for the last 2 decades. So a couple things, about Alberta. So other than the fact that Alberta is 100% fossil fuel dependent, both for their supply of electricity, but also in terms of their economy, it's important to recognize that they actually don't have great options when it comes to even generating electricity locally. It's also just as a kind of weird accident of fate that the most important agricultural sector in Alberta is cattle ranching, which is also the worst offender from the standpoint of climate and so forth, right? So what you do with the economy of Alberta is actually, I think, the central challenge when it comes to the questions of equity domestically. So Canada's already got, inside a lot of the conflicts that exist globally, which is that there are parts of the world that benefit enormously from the production of fossil fuels, and parts that don't, right? So, the proven oil reserves in Alberta, or in the tar sands generally, are at, at present market value equivalent to about 6 years worth of the entire country's GDP. So it is a massive and incredibly valuable resource. And even though people sometimes try to diminish it by saying that it's only a small fraction of current GDP, but it's important to recognize also the knock-on effects that the economy of Alberta has had. So if you look at, for example, a lot of very, very negative trends that have been going on in the United States with the decline of coal mining and resource extraction, or with the decline in manufacturing and so forth, and you look at the social and political consequences of those transitions, all those trends in Canada are better than they are in the United States. So if you look at inequality trends in Canada, they're not as bad as in the United States. If you look at the kind of populist backlash against trade, against immigration, against globalism, it's not as bad in Canada as in the United States. One of the major reasons that it's not as bad has been the capacity of the Alberta economy to absorb an incredible number of people. Like the fact that you can go to Fort McMurray and work at a Tim Hortons for $20 an hour, has a huge impact on Canada's economy and its capacity to, for example, absorb immigrants. And if you also look at the amount of blue-collar employment that Alberta economy has generated as well. Right? So Canada has suffered enormous shocks to its economy. For example, think of the elimination of the cod fishery in Newfoundland, or think of closing down. I mean, we also closed down our coal mining, right? So the Cape Breton coal mines were all closed down in 2005. And think of the decline in manufacturing in Ontario. So in a 10-year period, 300,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in Ontario. So why are there not, like these huge, swaths of angry former coal workers sitting, in a shack in Cape Breton, upset at the government, or, former fishers in Newfoundland, or disgruntled ex-manufacturing workers? Well, it's in part because enormous numbers of these people moved to Alberta. Right? So the rural population of Newfoundland declined by 20%. 25% of the population of Cape Breton Island left Cape Breton Island. And one of the places they went to in large numbers was Alberta. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? Is that the way in which Canada's managed a lot of transitions has been because of the vitality of the Alberta economy. Now, when you start talking about closing down the Alberta economy, then you have to wonder what you're going to do about it, right? So it is important, I guess, to the headline thing that I'd like to emphasize is that one of the things that Canada does better, and in particular does better than the United States, is making that kind of mobility possible. And so the portability of welfare state benefits, for example, are an important part of the reason why it's actually easy to move in Canada. And so when you wind up with a resource-based economy that you're then talking about making huge changes, you're inevitably going to create depressed economic regions. And trying to sustain those regions through policy is for the most part a bad idea. A politically difficult thing to say publicly, but in fact a very effective policy is to make it easy for people to leave those. So if anything I want to give a brief for, it's the encouraging mobility within Canada is one of the most significant ways in which we can make this transition less painful than it has to be.
Right, and finding other opportunities. And I think, again, kind of sitting for purchase here in Ontario, it's sometimes easy to forget how much of our quality of life, whether it's our healthcare system or otherwise, has ultimately been funded by GDP that has been sourced in our Canadian fossil fuels. So I think you raise a really, really important set of questions there, Joe. I'm going to come to a question on adaptation. I want to take that one to David and to Laura. And then I'm going to go back to Joe and to Jody for some notes of optimism. But first on adaptation, there seems to be a bit of a debate about the role of adaptation. Some activists would criticize it as a cop-out. Others see it as a reasonable, responsible approach, given the human capacity to innovate. I thought it was interesting that the COP26 communique specifically called out adaptation and, exhorted greater investment from regional development banks, from other financial institutions in climate adaptation. So talk to us, David, and then I'm going to go to you, Laura, on how adaptation fits into this net zero transition.
Sure. I think adaptation is natural and it makes sense. The criticism that I don't know of any jurisdiction that's saying we could just abandon all solutions. We don't need to change in any way other than to adapt. I don't think that's happening. So I'm not. That doesn't keep me up at night that it's going to be a dangerous distraction. But I'll also add that to me it's not the wicked problem that adapting that implementing these hard solutions will be, right? Adaptation comes naturally. The places that need to adapt are very motivated to do so, right? It's not the wicked problem that we had wicked in a problem definition context. where my emissions affect everybody, and it's not so my actions by extension don't necessarily benefit me so directly. So to me, adaptation is natural. It's understandable. We need to do it. Just look at the West Coast in the last week or so. I think it's just part of what we need to be doing now.
Great. Over to you, Laura, on adaptation.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that the important thing about adaptation is that it's to move away from the versus frame for adaptation versus mitigation, and really think about doing both at once. And I think about adaptation as something that we've now reached a point where adaptation is unavoidable. We are already experiencing climate change impacts in Canada, around the world. And even though we need to move really aggressively to take climate action, we've already locked ourselves into a certain amount of warming and chaos because of the greenhouse gas emissions that have been emitted to this point, and because of the lag in the systems. Action we take now doesn't, turn things around tomorrow. That's why it's so urgent that we take action as fast as possible. And so I think there's concern that there's that we might divert resources away from taking action as fast as possible, but they're two sides of the same problem. We try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we can try to maintain a livable climate for our planet, and we try to adapt to the impacts that are happening now, and think about all climate mitigation actions, what needs to be incorporated into them so that we are doing adaptation and strengthening our resilience at the same time. I think the key thing here is about planning adaptation, because we can do a lot of reactive adaptation after the flooding happens, after it's so hot we can't go outside, after asphalt is melting in the roads and so the cars won't drive on them anymore. But I think the goal here is to really think about proactive adaptation in the same way that we're thinking about proactive transition to fossil dependent economies and workers, and so that we can move people to a climate positive economy. Thinking about proactive adaptation, learn as much as we can about the impacts that are coming, and try to think about how we build resilience into our society to try to deal with that as much as we can.
Great, thank you. There's been a lot of cause for concern, even for alarm in our panel tonight. But I would be remiss if we didn't take some time to focus on the bright side here. So what is it, and I want to come to you, Jody, and then I'm going to go to Joe. What do we know about the behavior of markets or of individuals that makes you optimistic that we can achieve net zero in a non-zero sum way?
Cautiously optimistic and hopeful because markets are resilient, and I think investors have largely recovered from the clean tech bubble that burst in 2010. Okay, so we're seeing $500 billion in investment in clean tech last year, and that's forecasted to rise. And that tells me that there were some really important lessons that were learned from that very unfortunate time, but that we can use this time around. That makes me feel hopeful. For one, we know now clean tech is a different game than typical tech investments. And venture capitalists that were the main funders back in the day, in the early 2000s, they didn't appreciate that. They did not appreciate the physical component of building these technologies and the layers and layers of experimentation and failure that would happen. They also didn't appreciate the upfront costs and that massive amount of upfront investment that's required in clean tech. Again, really different from what they're used to with software companies. And so, with that all in mind, the risk tolerance now for the investment community in clean tech is a lot higher. And we're seeing, in addition to venture capitalists, now we have government funding that needs to go up hugely, though. But we have philanthropists and even banks and big companies are getting involved. this is really important. There are some partnerships that I'm really liking here with VCs and governments, right? As I mentioned earlier, governments have to play this role in the big ideas, right? When venture capitalists and banks don't want to get in on it, it's too early, they don't see the commercial viability. That's when governments need to be there, and then they can pass that off. There's got to be this natural transition to the private sector. I think we're seeing this happen, and it's gonna ramp up. The other area that's promising, and Claire, you alluded to it in kind of your reflection to my earlier response about ESG investing, is that I don't think markets are tolerant of information asymmetry and frictions when they realize that they're happening. So with greenwashing now being something that we're aware of, right? I feel hopeful that it's going to come to an end, because where governments have not been ready to impose regulation on companies to report carbon emissions or to hold these ESG funds to standards that can show that they're actually putting their money to these good causes. That's where there are these market-driven innovations and standards. And in COP26, I don't know when this is going to come out, but the International Financial Reporting Standards Body, which runs, basically tells 140 countries and all the companies within them, if you want to issue public debt and equity, this is what you need to report. They came out at COP26 saying that they have new carbon standards. I'm just waiting to get my hands on those, but they're promising 3 to 5 new carbon metrics. If that happens by 2023, it's game changing, because we've got standardized, consistent, timely reporting, right? Similar to what we have for financial reporting, and that, that's really the first step, transparency towards getting this to improved state.
So we can rely on some market mechanisms there to drive capital in the right direction. Before I go to Joe quickly on this this question about aspects of markets or of human behavior that give us reason for optimism, I'm just going to give a heads up to David that I'm going to come to you with a couple of technology questions, David. We've had one from the audience on hydrogen. Is hydrogen part of the answer? And a question on electric vehicles. You talked about the fact that EVs, particularly in urban areas, are going to be a huge part of the solution. But what about the overall environmental footprint of EVs? There's a lot of criticism of batteries, frankly, given the kind of heavy metal elements, et cetera, that it might be good for the climate, but that's not necessarily being synonymous with being good for the environment. So I'm going to come to you on that. But first, let me come to Joe then on what do we know about the behavior of individuals that would give you reason for optimism here? We need some of that.
Yeah, so the thing that's been making me feel better about it actually has been following the Tesla story and what's been going on with the automobile industry. And in terms of the role that markets play, I mean, it's important to recognize that there are some things that governments are very good at and also uniquely positioned to do. So for example, enacting carbon pricing is something that's an incredibly positive step. Only the government's in a position to do that. But the market is also, private actors are particularly good at doing certain kinds of things. Right? So what are markets good at? I mean, markets are better at innovation. And people sometimes say, oh, markets are better at rewarding success. That's actually not entirely true. What markets are uniquely good at doing is also penalizing failure. And that's actually where governments have greater difficulty, right? It's really hard to close something down, especially a giant bureaucracy. Think of the government of Canada trying to end rural mail service, right? And how they eventually just gave up on that, right? Even though it's a no-brainer, right? So markets, though, are really ruthless when it comes to penalizing actors who are in various ways acting irrationally. And the automobile industry, I mean, really behaved abysmally over the course of the last 3 decades when it came to the way in which it was dealing with electrical vehicles. And that is that there was, in many cases, like a cultural resistance to the idea. So if you look at, for example, the emissions scandal at Volkswagen, I don't know, I don't want engineers to take this personally, but a lot of engineers have this kind of love affair with the internal combustion engine. That they just didn't want that technology to die. And so at Volkswagen, they were competing with hybrid vehicles in Toyota. And they were just, determined to make diesel work to the point where they wound up breaking the law in order to pretend that their vehicles had lower emissions than they had, right? I mean, that was fundamentally irrational behavior. They should have just accepted the fact that they should be making electric vehicles. So the automakers, had this internal bureaucratic culture whereby they just refused to accept that there had to be technological innovation. So what happened is what actually intro economics says is supposed to happen, which is a new competitor came along and ate their lunch, right? That is that Tesla came along and got a stock valuation that now is higher than all three large American automakers combined, and put the fear of God into them. And so now all of a sudden they're all announcing their big plans for electrification. Now it's important to recognize, markets do some things well and some things bad, but it's really important to give them credit where credit is due. And that's exactly what markets are supposed to do. And governments can't do that kind of thing, right? Threaten hundreds of thousands of people with losing their jobs. Markets do have that kind of ruthlessness. So I've been really made happy by the Tesla stock valuation story. And not even so much because of what Tesla's doing, but because of the changes that it's forced in the rest of the automobile industry, which has been a really radical change. So that makes me feel better about it.
Yeah, and you've seen other competitors come in as well, like Lucid, for example, and others. So a lot to chew on there. So David, let me come back to you then. Hydrogen and EVs and overall environmental footprint.
Great. So, on hydrogen, hydrogen's having a moment now, and I think it deserves it. Where hydrogen can play a big role. 15 years ago, I first started my academic career. I did some work in the area, and then we were really seeing as vehicles as the hydrogen. That's where hydrogen was going to go, and I think more and more, partially because of the forces that Joe was mentioning there. Maybe that ship has sailed, or certainly at least there's a headwind. Batteries are an incumbent technology there, but hydrogen is used in heavy industry. So I mentioned the toughest third of emissions earlier. So to me, the great place for green hydrogen tech to serve those current industrial processes that are happening at scale that demand hydrogen now. So I think that's the best place to look. And there's some really cool tech, some of which coming out of U of T, looking at taking natural gas, splitting off the hydrogen, dropping the carbon in solid storable form. And I forget, they call it turquoise hydrogen or fuchsia or something. I'm not sure, but it's there's really great ideas around lower carbon hydrogen, and I think it's worth pursuing for heavy industry. EVs and I'll throw solar panels in there too, right? They've been in the news in a negative light based on their waste, right? So the whenever you do something at scale, this is sort of the engineer's nemesis. When you do something at scale, and when we talk about scale in the energy system, we need massive scales. You are going to step on some toes, right? There's going to be implications. There's going to be CO2 emissions associated with this, the manufacturing, et cetera, but there's going to be other issues, wind turbines, you name it, damaging birds, right? So there's just no such thing as a scale technology that doesn't have problems. It's a question of measuring the balance of those problems. In the list of problems associated with some of these technologies, the waste issue, to me, it's not zero, it's just far down on the list. The batteries in electric vehicles actually contain valuable stuff. I mean, the news article you read right beside waste in electric vehicles, the waste tsunami that's coming, is right beside an article that talks about we don't have enough lithium, right? So when you have density of waste like this, it's not unlike nuclear. When you have the density of waste, you've got opportunities for containment, but also for reuse. So I think that's a solvable thing. Don't let that keep you up at night.
Okay, well, that's great to hear, and maybe there are opportunities then in battery recycling. And Canada may have a moment, frankly, given that we are resource rich, not just in fossil fuels, but in other metals and minerals that are going to be, critical to this green transition. We've had a number of folks in the audience who have, pointed out that it's pretty easy to get pretty abstract pretty quickly in this, in this discussion. And is that, is that really a sort of an enemy of taking action? I mean, if it just seems like such a big problem that's kind of at the level of, international organizations or, or even nations, it's kind of overwhelming. And that, that drives some of us just to kind of scratch our heads and focus on something that we can wrap our heads around more immediately. So I want to come to each of you on the panel to talk about how we take this problem and we kind of bring it down to, I'll call it a human scale, certainly an enterprise scale, an individual enterprise scale, or, an individual sort of human scale, so that we can really do something, but something meaningful enough that the collective, outcome is where we need to get to. So, Al, says that one of the biggest challenges is to get people to understand how progress is measured and achieved in this way that people can relate to, and that these global and country goals are just way too big and abstract. Margaret has asked, what can individuals do to make a meaningful contribution? Very similarly, and Alan, who's not a fan of carbon taxes, he also asks, how do we get people to do something about climate change rather than just talk about it? So maybe I'll come back to David, and then I'm going to go to Jody, Laura, and Joe to just help us understand on a human scale what we can and need to do.
Sure. I think there's a lot, and one real surprise for me in the pandemic has been how climate change and this question that our audience is posing, what can we do to mitigate it, has been front and center. When the pandemic started, I thought this is going to the back burner for 5 years before we talk about this again. So it's really front and center. So I would say the good news is that this is on the front burner for big portions of our population, and therefore our governments and our corporations. So we're having a real moment. So we should acknowledge that. What can we do as individuals? Think about voting with your dollars, right? Yeah, your consumer choices. Maybe Jody has some suggestions for that. She probably has suggestions for companies that they can be more transparent into their practices and help you make those judgments. But so voting with your dollars is important. Voting with your vote is important as well. Supporting government policies that you think can be practical and can address the climate challenge. And then, and lastly, just looking around your lifestyle and your house. We at the university here is a good example, right? The university's done a lot of steps to get the university's house in order in terms of its emissions. It's got some clever heating stuff. You might have seen front campus is dug up. It looks like total mess right now, but it's dug up in part to install a geothermal system. They're greening their investment, $4 billion endowment. So these are steps that the university's taken as an organization. We can take versions of those ourselves.
Great, thank you. Thank you, David. Let me go to Jody on this.
Sure. I mean, like if you're an employee of a company and your company is actively opposing climate legislation, I think first and foremost, you need to address that, right? Like tell them it's not okay to issue, a nice looking corporate social responsibility report and use social media and other outlets to say how optimistic you are about your plans to go to net zero and so on, while at the same time pressing, politicians to delay climate action. Okay, so there are a lot of avenues through which employees are doing that. Anonymous forums, letter writing campaigns, but the point is to make your voice heard within your organization. I think the consumer point that David brought up is so important because it tells, if you have the means, right, to buy an electric vehicle or to install a smart heating and cooling system in your home, right, those things are more expensive right now. And I'll get to that when I talk about the carbon tax. But, those things are more expensive. But if you can buy them, you're sending a really strong demand signal to the markets and to companies and to governments that, we're willing to pay for this. We know it's important. Here's the money. Please go out and do more to drive down the cost so that everyone can adopt this. And you mentioned someone, is not a fan of a carbon tax. Of course, we don't want to be punished for our individual emissions or the emissions of organizations. A lot of this comes, our dependence on fossil fuels is not, our individual fault, right? But we need to shift our thinking. It's not about the tax per se. It's about doing everything we can to reduce the green premium, basically that difference between what it costs to have to choose a low carbon or a zero carbon alternative relative to a fossil fuel one. Okay, so the carbon price is about, spurring that innovation and the development of zero carbon technologies that eventually become cost competitive and then nudge us away from fossil fuel alternatives. So we just need to think of that in that lens and not about that's trying to punish each of us individually.
Yeah, well, just let me press you there a little bit though, because I mean, we've had subsidies for green vehicles, and I think a legitimate a legitimate criticism of those is that the people who can afford to be buying the latest Tesla actually don't need a government subsidy in order to do that. And in light of the pandemic, where we've seen really unprecedented need for support from governments for individuals, for communities that have been coping with COVID, are these kinds of kind of bespoke subsidies the right way to go? So I'm going to come back to you on that, Jody. I don't want to let you off the hook on that. But let me go to Laura on the question for individual action, and then I'm going to circle back to Joe, and maybe he's got some thoughts on that question as well. So Laura, over to you on human scale. Scale this for human beings, this problem in terms of actions.
Yeah, sure. I think the important thing to think about if you're thinking about taking individual action is to think about the ripples of those actions. And the answers have been right along these lines as well. So you're trying to think about how you can make a decision that reduces your greenhouse gas emissions, but in ways that hopefully triggers a systemic change in that same kind of area. And one of the things that does that, it feels a little bit like you're not doing enough, but you're actually doing a lot more than you think if you're talking about climate change in your everyday life, with your neighbor, with your family, with your colleagues, with your anyone that you speak to in the day. People tend not to bring up climate change, and if people don't hear about it, they think other people aren't worried about it as well. So one of the things you can do is take advantage of your power as a trusted messenger when you're talking to people, because people incorporate information that they get from people that they know in it's one of the strongest ways to drive change in people. But then, I think your question is really getting at what can I tangibly do? I'm really concerned about this in my day-to-day life. So one of the things that I teach sometimes is I don't even call it a poem, but the idea of fleet, heat, meet, repeat. And this is thinking about the way that you move around, how you heat where you live, what you eat, and thinking about how you can improve reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, move towards decarbonization on all of those fronts whenever you have the decision-making ability to do so. Your choices are sometimes constrained, and you can't make a different choice other than your car, the one that you can afford, and there's no other transit option. But what can you do that sends signals to others that you are making decisions based on greenhouse gas emissions and carbon pollution? And then I think the other thing to think about is try to reflect on where you have influence. Jody talked about it at work, which is a really great example of some of the ways that you have, the options that you have for intervening in different places in your society. What's important to you, and where do you have access? Maybe it's related to your money. Are you a pension beneficiary? What can you do to find out whether your pension is investing in fossil fuels, and how can you shift that to clean energy? So these are some of the ways that you can think about all the different kinds of power you have, and really think about actions that encourage others to act the same way, or encourage governments and corporations to change what they're offering, the way that they're constraining your choices, because a lot of this individual action is very constrained systemically.
Yeah, some good advice there, and that I like that idea about thinking about what the ripple effect of your own actions are going to be, and then that is a way to kind of harness this power of markets ultimately when there is this signal, when there is this demand. So let me come to Joe then on human scaling this problem, and then I want to go to Jody, and maybe I'll come back to you, Joe, for this question. About what is the right design for these kind of incentives. I use the example for subsidies in Ontario for green vehicles, but there's a lot of kind of thorny public policy kind of design questions here. So Joe, and then Jody, and then I'm going to come back to Joe.
Well, what I wanted to suggest actually was that on the policy front is one of the few areas where we actually have been given a break when it comes to this problem. And so, like, if you think of climate change in the philosophical literature, it's often described as a kind of perfect moral storm, where it's like the confluence of all the kind of worst characteristics that a problem can have. And so the first huge problem with climate change has to do with, as already been mentioned, the lag in what we do now and the effects that it has. So the debate we're having right now, the policy debate, is basically about what it'll look like 50 years from now. What goes on between now and the next 50 years, there basically the die has already been cast. So that's a peculiarity. If any people are wondering why there's a philosopher on this panel, it's because that lag actually gives the problem a bunch of very unusual and tricky characteristics. And so philosophers got interested in it because of that time lag. But that time lag politically generates a huge problem, which is that the constituency who stands to benefit from carbon mitigation and carbon abatement and climate change mitigation in the present isn't here yet. Right, so that's why I have some indulgence for the Greta Thunbergs of the world and getting younger people involved, because they're at least going to be around and receive some of the benefits of our current policy choices. But the absence of the primary constituency who's going to benefit is a huge problem then in generating political mobilization. Then you've got the fact that it's a global problem, and the fact is that we need to do our part, even though what we do is going to be easily eclipsed by policy decisions made in China, made in India, et cetera. Right? And that motivates the argument that says, oh, well, we're just a tiny part of the problem, let them fix it or whatever, right? So it's really easy to free ride when you have a global problem like that. And then there's the fact that like fossil fuel is incredibly beneficial, right? It's a really difficult transition to make, right? So it's not like, oh, you get rid of the Freon in your fridge or whatever. Like replacing fossil fuel in its applications, right, is an incredible challenge. So it's a really, really, really bad problem, right? So you might think, oh, it's impossible, like there's no light at the end of the tunnel, et cetera. But we've been handed like one positive thing, which is that it's amenable to an incredibly simple, attractive, and efficient policy solution, which is pricing carbon emissions. Right? And so carbon pricing is this kind of, again, it's like a godsend, right? Which is that if only every environmental problem could be solved so easily, right? But actually things like arsenic are actually way harder to handle from a regulatory perspective. Right? So the carbon content of fossil fuel is really, really easy to price and regulate, in part because there's a bottleneck at the level of refining of fossil fuels. And so you can easily identify where it's being produced. So you don't have to, for example, tax it in the hand of consumers, right? You can tax it earlier up the supply pipeline and so on. So carbon taxes, my preferred policy form of carbon pricing, is an incredibly powerful policy response. And it's sometimes spoken of as though it's a minor thing, like, oh, it changes gas prices, and therefore we still have to do a bunch of more stuff, right? But it's important to recognize that carbon taxes change every single price in the entire economy, because fossil fuels are so important to every aspect of the economy, right? So if you walk into a supermarket, right, the change in every single price for every single food product that you can purchase has been affected by those carbon taxes. And those taxes are steering you in the direction of making more environmentally responsible choices. So they radically diminish the need for a kind of agonizing personal responsibility. If we needed everybody to have like a crisis of conscience to solve this problem, then, thank God we don't need that, because we would never solve the problem if we required every individual to come up with their own personal plan for solving climate change, right? So really the only bit of good luck we've got in this is that we actually don't need to sweat a lot of this personal responsibility stuff, because carbon pricing handles so much of it. Then the only qualification on that is that handles the negative, like the cost or the damages caused by carbon emissions. It doesn't handle the positive benefits that could be generated through negative emission technologies or preserving forests and things like that. So there is still room for policy and subsidies when it comes to the positive externality of, say, carbon scrubbing. But as far as the negative externality of carbon emissions, pricing really is like the closest to a magic bullet that you're ever going to get in the domain of environmental policy.
Okay, lots to think about there, and we've got some more questions. I know on carbon taxes are coming into our Q&A, but let me go to Jody and come back to you and ask you about subsidies and what you think the right levers are policy-wise for governments in this space.
Sure. I think you asked that question specifically in the context of EVs, right? And I very much agree. At that time, though, earlier on, we didn't have a lot of options, right? Tesla was there with their EV. It was very expensive. I wanted it. I couldn't afford it. But now I'm looking at Nissan and Hyundai and Subaru and Tesla have, a joint venture here too. And these cars are way more affordable, right? And it just really changes that structure in how we're thinking about our decisions and where we're going to put our money. So, but if it's a broader question, right, taxes versus subsidies versus other mechanisms, I think it's all unique and dependent on the industry, unfortunately. So I don't think I can provide one kind of a blanket approach. But again, keeping the bigger picture in mind, how do we make these low carbon or zero carbon solutions feasible? How do we ensure that the infrastructure is in place once we get the solutions to deploy them, so that we get them to market, we get them to scale, and then everything else will follow, right? The competition will follow, the demand will go up, prices will go down, and then we get the markets working as they should.
Right. Certainly those market signals are important. And Joe, I take what you say about carbon taxes. In Canada, the current design, though, and the reason that I think that this was sort of sold politically, or it was sold politically to consumers, at least on the basis that it's all going to get returned to you. And maybe, arguably, if you look at Canada's gap in terms of investment in R&D, and that was one of the points that was made, really early on in this panel, is that Canada is a laggard in investment. Maybe we should be taking that carbon tax and instead of handing it back to consumers, maybe we should be looking for ways to, increase productivity and enhancing investment, as opposed to, kind of giving us more space for consumption. But this is a difficult problem in a democracy. You've just seen the governors in the Northeast states that had committed to a cap and trade system abandon it in the face of high prices at the pump, which is presumably when that would actually be most effective. But they're sensing, I think probably rightly, a limited, appetite for that on the part of the public. So, I think it really does kind of come back to us and our responsibilities as individuals. And it's, I think, easy oftentimes to kind of pass the buck and say that it's somebody else's responsibility to deal with this. We did have a very helpful clarification from Linda. Thank you, Linda. That's turquoise hydrogen, and she recommends that we take a look at char technologies coming out of U of T. So we're going to go to, if we can, to some more questions in the chat. We're just about 13 minutes from the top of the hour, so we probably have about 10 minutes more left. I do want to come back to you, David, though, on the Climate Positive Institute, this multidisciplinary initiative at U of T, and give you an opportunity to talk to us about that. We're seeing the multidisciplinary nature of the problem that we have here. And it's not an accident that we have an environmental studies professor, we've got an engineering professor, we've got a professor of accounting and management, and we've got a professor of philosophy on this panel. So elaborate just for us a little bit about what is going on at U of T.
Thanks for the opportunity, Claire. Yeah, we talked about, what individuals can do. I touched on a little bit what the university is doing as an institution, in its own systems. But there's a much bigger question here, and that is what the university can do in terms of our tremendous roster of research, our minds that we have on campus. And when you look at the whole tri-campus, just that the depth and breadth of expertise in all of these disciplines needed to develop really workable climate solutions. To be honest, it's uniquely possible in the great universities of the world. There's no government that has this roster. There's no companies that have such a roster. We've really got an opportunity here. So thanks for the opportunity to mention this. We're organizing on that right now. And we've developed this new thing, this tri-campus initiative called Climate Positive Energy. And it's to do, just as you highlighted, bring experts from across the full spectrum of expertise, the social, the technical, the scientific, the political, the legal, architectural, all of them, the tremendous depth of U of T expertise and bring that to bear on these solutions and develop workable pathways. So we're really excited to be launching that in the next few weeks officially. So leaking here, I guess. But I think I'm really excited about that role for the university, in part because we can uniquely serve that role.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's something that U of T just does so well. Excellent scale. And I have to give a shout out to U of T. I finished my term as chair of the governing council, but I still feel like I want to be a champion for U of T, which is one of the top universities in the world, a public university with private peers that I think does excellence and access at scale so well. We're going to be going soon to a closing, a speed round, and I'm going to ask each of you for kind of a key insight or a takeaway. But we've had an interesting question on deglobalization, and so I want to come to Laura, and then I'm going to see if I can get Jody and Joe here in on this question. Is part of the solution then, kind of becoming more local, which has attendant costs, frankly, as we're seeing with broken supply chains right now for other reasons, creating price spikes and shortages and so on and so forth. So, definitely some difficulties there. But is that part of the answer, a kind of a more localized approach to meeting our needs? But are there costs associated with that? I'm going to ask you to try and be brief on this. I know it's a big question. We could do a whole panel on that alone. But I'm going to go to Laura, Jody, and Joe, and then I'm going to go to our speed round.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. So I think there are big opportunities in thinking about how we can meet our needs using local resources and how we can develop livelihoods that are based locally as well. And I think one of the benefits of the climate positive transition, and when we think about designing a climate positive economy, is that there are a lot of opportunities for this kind of decentralized benefit. There's a lot of centralization in a fossil intensive economy. And so if we think about the distribution of renewable energy sources, if we're trying to think about lower carbon embodied energy and some of the materials we use and how we can use materials that are closer to us, there are a lot of considerations when we think about how we take advantage of those opportunities when we're thinking of climate positive design for our economy. That said, I mean, you hinted at this in your question. This is a major transformation, and we have to negotiate the trade-offs that come with changes. But I think the thing to focus on here is that we don't have an option to avoid a major transition for our society. The climate change impacts are coming and are here really, and our goal is to avoid catastrophic impacts.
Yeah.
And so really we're thinking about how we can do this transition in a way where we consciously deal with trade-offs that come up.
Right. Good. Jody, quickly on this question of deglobalization, and then Joe, and then I'm going to go to our speed round.
Yeah, I tend not to think that this will help us in our bigger plans to decarbonize, simply because, as Laura mentioned at the end of her response there, we all need to do this, okay? So I think I said this earlier on, like if we can get our carbon tax to work well here, I think we should think very seriously about a border adjustment so that we are factoring in the price of carbon of the things that we bring in. So again, to Joe's earlier comments, right, this carbon price can really help us kind of to smooth out the differences that countries are adopting or not adopting for climate policy.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you on the border adjustment. I think it's absolutely essential if we're going to go that route, particularly when we've got nations at different stages in this transition. So, Joe, over to you on this deglobalization question, and then I'm going to go back out to all of you for a takeaway insight.
Yeah, well, so I started talking about remote communities, so I'll circle back to that. It seems to me that the solution there has to involve more integration into the global economy, global energy systems, that you don't have local resources. A lot of it just depends upon what the winning technology is, right? The winning technology is solar, right? Well, then suddenly equatorial regions become, much more significant energy producers. So Europe is looking at importing electricity from North Africa, where it can be generated more efficiently. All of that requires, changes in transmission lines, more global integration. So there are scenarios in which you could do it locally, but there are also a lot of scenarios in which you can only do it with greater global integration. So I think a lot of it just depends upon what winds up being most.
Interesting. So we've got panelists coming out at different points on this conversation. So sign of a good conversation, and watch this space. So we're almost at the top of the hour, and I do want to go back to each of you then and give you an opportunity for just a closing takeaway, insight or exhortation for our audience. Let me start with Jody, and then I'm going to go to Joe, Laura, and I'm going to wrap up with David.
Thanks. I decided to wait to see how the panel would evolve before I would reflect on this question. I think, the takeaway I have from this is the scale of the problem is massive. We already know that. There are lots of reasons to feel hopeful. I think we have a lot of the technologies and the ideas, but we need to deploy them. So to the extent that you can do everything you can with your voice, with your votes, with your purchasing decisions, now's the time to go for it.
Let's move from aspiration to action. Okay, so Joe.
Oh yes, I just wanted to end with a little upbeat note that when I want to cheer myself up on this, I remind myself of what the solar constant is. Right? In other words, our energy budget, we don't suffer from a lack of energy on this planet. What we suffer from is a lack of energy in usable form, right? That's where the engineers come in, right? So the Earth is being struck at any given moment by 180,000 terawatts of energy, of which plants capture approximately 40, right? And total human consumption adds up to about 20, but we're not capturing that. We're just using old stuff that was captured by plants a long time ago. But we have to capture only just an extremely small percentage of the solar energy budget in order to solve this problem. And so if we keep an eye on that big picture, I think that it helps us to think about the future in a more positive way.
That's a great way to think about it. Thank you for that perspective. Let me come to you, Laura, and then I'm going to go to David.
Sure. I wanted to end by trying to give a kind of way forward wrap up for the talk today. And that's by saying something I think about a lot, which is all policy is climate policy. Some of it has unintentional climate impacts and some of it has, planned climate impacts. So I think our way forward is to really think about all policy through this lens of climate and what kind of, climate we want to live in, we can live in, and what kind of policy mix and technology mix are we going to use in order to get to that point. And I want to end with a little bit of hope too, because something I like to say is that it's a challenging time when we think about the scope and scale of this problem, but we're all also alive at just the right time to make a huge difference in the next decade on climate action. So that's something that I like to try to leave people with.
Great. And I'm definitely going to think about fleet, heat, meet, and repeat. So thank you for sharing that with us. David, over to you.
Sure, Claire, two reflections. One is, this has just been great, and I've loved all the perspectives here from Jody, Joe, and Laura. The last one from me is you started us off with the biggest challenges, and I really see those as the biggest opportunities, right? There's some parts of the climate solutions that we have now, and I'm thinking from a technical perspective. Some of that stuff is getting into place, those easy solutions I mentioned earlier. But the harder ones, nuts that have yet to be cracked, and that's the opportunity for Canada.
Fantastic. So that's a very hopeful note to end on. To you, our audience, you will find in our chat a link to a survey. Please do take the opportunity to fill out that survey. It really helps us get better at what we're doing here at Disruptors and Dilemmas. But I think we can agree that we've had a fantastic conversation. I have certainly learned a lot and been energized, no pun intended, in this conversation. And I want to thank our panelists, Jody, Joe, Laura, and David, for joining us tonight from all across U of T, representing arts and science, engineering, St. George, UTM, and UTSC. I also want to thank the Alumni Affairs and Events team at U of T, without whom none of this would have been possible. You know who you are, and you've been fantastic in making tonight work. I want to recognize our presenting sponsor, Bennett Jones, for their continued support of Disruptors and Dilemmas. And you can find more out about climate change and on ESG topics generally at Bennett Jones's website, www.bennettjones.com. I also want to thank our sponsors, TD Insurance and MBNA, for their support of Disruptors through the University of Toronto Affinity Partner Program. And finally, I want to thank you, our audience, for being with us tonight and indeed for being part of our conversation. It's been a really, really rich conversation, and I thank you for that. And so on that note, till next time, from all of us here at Disruptors and Dilemmas, be well.